Okay, let me move to policy implications now. First policy question is, how is changing farm structure affecting the potential for land expansion to support smallholder agricultural growth? And this is the graph I replicated a moment ago. Now we'll look at the amount of land that's under the control of small-scale farms. And as you can see, they're less, if you combine the large scale and medium scale, at least in 2 out of those 3 countries, they exceed the amount of land in small scale. So if you add all of these 3 columns up, then you get to the last column, and this shows us the millions of hectares in each country that are already allocated under the control of small, medium, and large scale. Now let's contrast that to estimates of the amount of land, arable land, that's remaining. This is non-forested arable land, including grassland, that could be converted into crop production. And here are the numbers. And this comes from some estimates that are also in a food policy article in the same issue, Food Policy, August, I think, of 2014. So potentially available cropland remaining, if you compare those 2 last columns, you'll see that in Zambia's case, roughly 2/3 of total potential for arable land in Zambia. Roughly 2/3 is already controlled, but it has significant potential for expansion. By contrast, in Kenya, which is a much more land-constrained country, a little bit more than 80% of all of its potentially available cropland is already under control, and very little left for future allocation. So there's differences across countries, and that needs to be kept in mind. Africa is a very heterogeneous place. But most of the countries are sort of in the Kenya situation, the Ugandas, the Nigerias, the Ethiopias, Rwandas, Malawi. There's a lot of highly populated countries that seem to be more in line with the Kenya story than with the Zambia story. Ghana is sort of in between. Roughly 75% of all of its potential available cropland is now already under control. So, we need to think through carefully, given the fact that rural populations are going to continue to grow, and as I mentioned before, that there's this rural employment youth issue that needs to be factored in to maintain the potential for area expansion for future generations. And here's that point. So when you look at total population projections, the projection for sub-Saharan Africa, that's the only region of the world where rural populations are continuing to rise and will continue to do so all the way up and past 2050. These projections come from the United Nations 2013 projections for rural population growth. So there's going to be more rural people in sub-Saharan Africa by 2050 than in China and Southeast Asia put together. This shows you the nature of the challenge that policymakers are facing. And then this graph comes from the World Bank's recent study on youth employment in Africa. And they show that by 2020, so 5 years from now, the vast majority of jobs that are going to be available in Africa are going to be in the informal sector and in agriculture. So even though wage jobs in the non-farm sector are growing rapidly in percentage terms, they're starting from a very low base. And so even rapid growth from a low base, it's going to be a decade or 2 before they account for a sizable proportion of the jobs in Africa. But by contrast, agriculture is going to continue to dominate, and you can see here that agriculture alone is going to be providing more employment for Africans than the informal sector, wage services, and wage industry put together. So for policy reasons, one has to keep that in mind. If land is available for expansion in rural areas, then this could greatly relieve the employment or the unemployment problems that may arise in the future. By contrast, if there is little or no land for expansion, this could be, as some have argued, this could be a politically explosive issue for African governments to deal with in the future. Now, our last conclusion here is to review the evidence on security of land tenure. I haven't talked too much about that so far, and how that affects farmers' willingness to make improvements in their land, and especially the gendered impacts of that. So I'd like to draw your attention to a recent Landesa website. Landesa is a Seattle-based organization. I've included the website here. So I'm just going to talk about one or two or three of the findings that they've highlighted recently on their site. Very interesting. In Ghana, the larger the share of household land owned by women, the larger the share of household expenditures spent on food and education. So this comes from Cheryl Doss, her work on Ghana. In Uganda, providing a family with full ownership rights over a plot of land increases many forms of sustainable intensification and management practices, which is understood as being increasingly important for maintaining productivity over time. Here's a finding from Tanzania. Women who report having strong property and inheritance rights were nearly 3 times more likely to be employed outside of the home, more than twice as likely to be self-employed, and earned 3.8 times more income. It's an incredible finding. In communities in which women's property and inheritance rights were stronger, women's individual savings were 35% larger. This comes from Peterman. And then lastly, in Ethiopia, households that have fully secure and transferable rights had 5.6% higher agricultural productivity and were 60% more likely to invest in terracing. Okay, so this is a smattering of findings that lead us to this conclusion, that improving security of tenure and land rights could significantly raise food production in the region, could certainly raise the nutritional status of people within the family, have poverty-reducing effects, and promote sustainable land management practices. Now, the issue still remains, what constitutes security of tenure? That's a thorny issue, and as I said before, the evidence seems to suggest that it's very context-specific. There's no one specific kind of tenure arrangement that uniformly provides greater security of tenure.